Hey guys, tonight we're traveling through the steam-filled kitchens of Quebec diners where the first crispy fries meet squeaky cheese curds, through the warm farmhouse kitchens of Ontario where butter tarts bubble golden in cast-iron ovens, and into the cozy bakeries of maritime provinces where flaky pastries emerge from wood-fired ovens with the morning mist. You can almost smell the maple syrup caramelizing, hear the sizzle of fresh gravy hitting hot fries, and feel the satisfying crunch of pastry between your teeth. But here's the thing. Once you start diving deep into the real stories behind Canada's most beloved comfort foods, you probably won't survive this without developing serious cravings for authentic poutine at 2 a.m. and an uncontrollable urge to hunt down the perfect butter tart in small-town bakeries across the country. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love knowing we're sharing this moment across different time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a snowy street corner in Warwick, Quebec in 1957. The winter air bites at your cheeks as you push through the door of La Lutin Quai Rit, the Laughing Goblin, a small restaurant that's about to accidentally create one of Canada's most iconic dishes. The bell above the door chimes and you're hit with the warmth of the dining room, the smell of fryer oil, and the chatter of locals seeking refuge from the cold. Behind the counter, Fernand Lachance is wiping down glasses, unaware that he's about to become part of culinary legend. You watch as Eddie Lanesse, a regular customer and local truck driver, approaches the counter with an unusual request. He's tired of ordering fries and cheese curds separately, tired of juggling two containers while trying to eat in his truck between deliveries. "Can you put them together in the same bag?" he asks, gesturing toward the golden fries cooling under the heat lamp and the fresh cheese curds sitting in their white paper wrapping. Fernand shrugs. It seems harmless enough. He scoops the hot fries into a paper bag, then adds a handful of cheese curds on top. As he hands it over, he chuckles and says, "That's going to make a mess. Ça va faire un maudit poutine." In Quebec slang, poutine means a mess, and Fernand has no idea he's just named what will become Quebec's signature dish. But you know something. Fernand doesn't. This isn't quite the poutine we know today. You watch Eddie walk away with his bag of fries and cheese curds, and you realize this moment is just the beginning. The dish needs one more crucial element, and it won't appear for another few years. You feel the weight of witnessing history in its incomplete form, like watching the first rough draft of a masterpiece. Fast forward with me now to 1964, and you're standing in another Quebec establishment. This time it's Drummondville, and you're inside Leroy Jussip, watching Jean-Paul Roy perfect what Fernand started. The restaurant is busier now, filled with the sounds of sizzling griddles and animated French conversation. Roy has been thinking about that combination of fries and cheese curds, but he's realized something crucial. The dish needs sauce. Not just any sauce, but something that will unite the elements, something warm enough to slightly melt the cheese curds while maintaining their essential squeak. You observe as Roy ladles rich brown gravy over a plate of fresh-cut fries and cheese curds. The gravy is made from a blend of chicken and beef stock, thickened to the perfect consistency. Not too thin that it makes the fries soggy, not too thick that it overwhelms the delicate balance. As the warm gravy hits the white cheese curds, you hear that magical sound, a gentle hiss as the curds begin to soften around the edges while maintaining their distinctive texture. Roy slides the plate across the counter, and you know you're witnessing the birth of true poutine. The cheese curds are crucial to understanding this dish, and you need to appreciate their journey to this moment. You find yourself transported to a dairy farm outside Montreal in the early morning hours. The cows have been milked, and you're watching the ancient alchemy of cheese making unfold. Fresh milk is heated and curdled, the whey separated from the curds through a process that hasn't changed much in centuries. These aren't just any cheese curds, they're fresh, white, and squeaky, made from the same day's milk. When you bite into a proper cheese curd, it should squeak against your teeth, a sign of its freshness and the specific protein structure that makes this possible. The squeak is everything. You learn that cheese curds lose their squeak within days of being made, as the protein structure changes and the moisture content shifts. This is why authentic poutine can only be made with local fresh curds. It's not just about taste, it's about texture, about that distinctive sound that tells you the cheese is at its peak. You understand now why poutine remained a regional dish for so long. It couldn't travel far from its source because the key ingredient had such a short window of perfection. You watch Quebec dairy farmers perfecting their craft, generation after generation, learning the subtle signs that indicate when curds are ready. The temperature of the milk, the timing of the rennet addition, the way the curds form and separate, it's all crucial. These farmers don't know they're creating the foundation for a dish that will one day represent Canadian cuisine around the world. They're simply focused on making the best cheese they can, following traditions passed down from French settlers who brought their dairy knowledge to the New World centuries earlier. Now you're traveling through rural Quebec in the 1960s and 70s, watching poutine spread from restaurant to restaurant, each chef adding their own touches. You visit small-town diners where the owners hand-cut their fries, soak them in cold water to remove excess starch, then fry them twice, once at a lower temperature to cook them through, then again at high heat to achieve that perfect golden crispness. The gravy recipes vary slightly from place to place. Some use more chicken stock, others more beef, some add a touch of Worcestershire sauce or a hint of herbs. But the core elements remain constant: fresh cut fries, squeaky cheese curds, and rich brown gravy. You observe the cultural significance developing around this simple dish. In working-class communities across Quebec, poutine becomes comfort food in the truest sense, cheap, filling, and satisfying after long days of physical labor. Truck drivers like Eddie Linnes spread word of the dish as they travel their routes. Factory workers grab poutine for lunch breaks. Families share large orders on weekend nights. The dish embodies the French-Canadian spirit of making something magnificent from humble ingredients, of finding joy and comfort in simplicity. But let's step back even further, because you need to understand the deeper roots that made poutine possible. You find yourself in 17th century New France, watching French colonists adapt their culinary traditions to the ingredients and conditions of their new homeland. They brought knowledge of dairy making, of creating rich gravies and sauces, of the importance of fat and comfort in surviving harsh winters. These early settlers couldn't have imagined poutine, but they laid the groundwork: the dairy traditions, the sauce-making techniques, the cultural appreciation for hearty, warming foods. You watch indigenous peoples sharing their knowledge of maple syrup and local ingredients with French settlers, creating the foundation for the sweet and savory combinations that would later characterize much of Canadian cuisine. The exchange of culinary knowledge happened slowly, respectfully, creating new traditions that blend European techniques with North American ingredients and indigenous wisdom. The potato itself has its own journey to this moment. you witness the introduction of potatoes to French-Canadian agriculture. Watch farmers learning which varieties grow best in Quebec's climate, which types make the best fries. The perfect poutine potato is russet or similar, high in starch, low in sugar, capable of achieving that ideal texture of crispy outside and fluffy inside when properly prepared. Moving forward in time, you're now in the 1980s, watching poutine begin its expansion beyond Quebec. You visit Toronto, where the first poutine shops opened to serve homesick Quebecois and curious Ontarians. The challenge is immediate. Finding proper cheese curds outside of Quebec proves nearly impossible. Early poutine attempts in other provinces use mozzarella or other cheeses, but they lack the squeak, the specific texture, the authentic experience. Gradually, cheese producers in other provinces begin making curds specifically for poutine, but it takes years to perfect the process and establish distribution networks. You observe the resistance too. In English Canada, some view poutine as too French, too Quebec, too different. Food critics dismiss it as junk food, as a passing fad. But you watch as the dish slowly wins converts, one perfect plate at a time. The combination is simply too satisfying to ignore. The salt and fat and richness hitting pleasure centers in the brain. The textural contrast between crispy fries and squeaky curds and smooth gravy, creating a complex sensory experience that keeps people coming back. Now shift your attention to butter tarts, and you find yourself in a completely different part of Canadian culinary history. You're standing in a pioneer kitchen in Ontario in the 1890s, watching a farm wife named Sarah work with the ingredients she has on hand. The winter has been long, supplies are running low, but she needs to create something special for her family's Sunday dinner. She has butter, brown sugar, eggs, and syrup, the basic building blocks of survival cooking that can be transformed into something magical with the right technique and a lot of love. You watch Sarah's weathered hands work the pastry dough, rolling it thin on a wooden board dusted with flour. She's making individual tart shells, pressing the dough into small metal forms her husband fashioned from tin cans. This isn't fancy baking, this is practical cooking, making dessert from whatever staples remain in the pantry. But you can see the care in her movements, the years of experience guiding her hands as she crimps the edges of each tart shell. The filling she creates is pure alchemy. You observe as she melts butter in a small pot, then stirs in brown sugar until it dissolves into a rich amber mixture. She beats eggs in a ceramic bowl, then slowly incorporates them into the butter-sugar base, whisking constantly to prevent them from scrambling. The final addition is syrup, sometimes maple, sometimes corn syrup, sometimes a combination of both. The mixture smells like caramelized sugar and comfort, like everything warm and sweet about home. But here's where butter tart tradition gets interesting. And you find yourself in kitchens across Ontario watching different families develop their own variations. Some add raisins, plump and sweet, that burst with concentrated fruit flavor when bitten. Others prefer pecans, adding crunch and nuttiness to the smooth filling. Some families swear by a combination of both, while purists insist that true butter tarts should contain nothing but the essential filling. You realize you're witnessing the birth of one of Canada's most passionate food debates, a controversy that will persist for over a century. You visit the kitchen of Margaret Wilson in Barrie, Ontario in 1915, watching her add a handful of raisins to her butter tart filling. Her grandmother's recipe called for them. She explains to her daughter because in the old days dried fruit was precious and adding it to desserts marked special occasions. The raisins plump up in the sweet filling, becoming little pockets of concentrated sweetness that complement the rich butterscotch-like base. Across town, you observe James Mackenzie's wife Eleanor preparing her butter tarts with chopped pecans instead. She learned this variation from a neighbor whose family had roots in the American South, where pecans grew abundantly. The nuts add textural interest and a slightly bitter note that balances the intense sweetness of the filling. Her tarts have a different character entirely, more complex, less uniformly sweet, with each bite offering a slightly different combination of flavors and textures. You need to understand the technical challenges these early bakers faced. Without precise temperature controls or reliable ovens, making butter tarts required intuition and experience. You watch Sarah check her tarts through the oven door, looking for the subtle signs that indicate doneness. The filling should be set but still slightly jiggly in the center, golden brown on top but not burned. Too little time in the oven, and the filling remains runny too much, and it becomes hard and candy-like instead of maintaining that perfect chewy, gooey texture that defines a great butter tart. The pastry itself presents its own challenges. You observe bakers working with lard or butter, creating shells that need to be sturdy enough to hold the filling but tender enough to complement it. The pastry can't be too thick or it overwhelms the filling, too thin and it becomes soggy. The edges need to be high enough to contain the filling as it bubbles and expands during baking, but not so high that they brown too quickly. You're transported now to rural Alberta in the 1920s, where homesteaders have brought butter tart recipes from Ontario and are adapting them to prairie conditions. The ingredients are similar, but the environment is different. Drier air affects how pastry behaves, different ovens require timing adjustments, and local supplies sometimes necessitate substitutions. You watch a farm wife named Helen substitute honey for corn syrup when her supply runs out, creating a butter tart with a more complex floral sweetness. These adaptations help you understand how butter tarts became truly Canadian rather than remaining a regional Ontario specialty. As families moved across the country, they carried their recipes with them, but those recipes evolved to accommodate new conditions and available ingredients. The basic formula remained constant: pastry shell, butter, brown sugar, eggs, syrup. But the details varied, creating a rich tradition of family variations and regional preferences. You find yourself at a church bake sale in Winnipeg in 1935, watching women compare their butter tart techniques. Each baker is convinced her method is superior, and you realize you're witnessing the development of butter tart orthodoxy. Mrs. Thompson insists on using only real butter, never margarine. Mrs. Schmidt swears by adding a pinch of salt to enhance the sweetness. Mrs. Anderson argues that corn syrup creates a better texture than maple syrup, while Mrs. Kowalski counters that maple syrup provides superior flavor. The Great Depression affects butter tart making in ways you hadn't expected. You observe families making them less frequently as ingredients become expensive luxuries, but when they do make them, the tarts carry extra emotional weight. They represent abundance, celebration, the ability to transform basic ingredients into something special. Children who grow up during these years will associate butter tarts with rare treats, with special occasions, with the love that motivated their mothers to spend precious butter and sugar on something purely for pleasure. World War II brings rationing, and you watch Canadian bakers adapting butter tart recipes to wartime restrictions. Sugar is scarce, butter is limited, eggs are precious. Some bakers substitute honey or maple syrup for white sugar, others reduce the amount of butter and add a touch of vegetable oil. The tarts that emerge from wartime kitchens may not taste exactly like their pre-war predecessors, but they maintain the essential character, that combination of rich sweetness and tender pastry that defines comfort. You need to witness the rise of butter tarts beyond home kitchens. In the 1950s, you visit small-town bakeries across Canada where commercial butter tart production begins. The challenge is maintaining the homemade quality while scaling up production. You watch bakers experimenting with techniques for creating consistent pastry shells, for mixing large batches of filling that maintain the proper texture, for timing ovens full of tarts so they all bake evenly. The bakery versions introduce new variables to the butter tart tradition. Some use different pastry recipes optimized for commercial production. Others experiment with filling ratios to achieve longer shelf life. You observe customer preferences developing. Some people prefer the slightly more uniform taste of bakery butter tarts, while others insist that only homemade versions capture the true essence of the dessert. By the 1960s, you're witnessing butter tarts becoming recognized as distinctly Canadian. Food writers begin including them in articles about Canadian cuisine, and you watch as regional variations become points of pride rather than simply practical adaptations. Ontario claims them as originally Ontarian, while other provinces argue that their variations represent improvements on the basic theme. You observe the Great Raisin debate intensifying. At community gatherings, church socials, and family reunions, you witness passionate discussions about whether butter tarts should contain raisins. The pro-raisin faction argues that raisins add necessary textural interest and a touch of tartness that balances the sweetness. The anti-raisin crowd insists that raisins are unnecessary additions that interfere with the pure butter-sugar-egg harmony that makes butter tarts perfect. Pecan supporters form a third faction, arguing that nuts provide better textural contrast than raisins without adding unwanted sweetness. Now you need to understand the broader context of maritime comfort foods. So you find yourself on the Atlantic coast in the early 1800s, watching the development of foods that would define East Coast Canadian cuisine. The maritime environment creates specific culinary needs and opportunities. Preservation techniques for surviving long winters, hearty foods for sustaining people through physical labor, and creative uses for ingredients that arrive by ship or can be gathered from the sea and land. You're standing in a Halifax kitchen in 1820, watching a ship captain's wife named Mary prepare for her husband's return from a 3-month voyage. She's making dishes that can keep well and provide substantial nutrition, meat pies with thick pastry crusts that serve as both container and sustenance, dense breads that won't spoil quickly, and preserves that capture summer flavors for winter consumption. The pastry techniques you observe here will influence much of maritime baking. You watch Mary work with lard and butter, creating dough that's sturdy enough for meat pies but can also be adapted for sweeter applications. Her hands move with practiced efficiency, incorporating fat into flour until the mixture resembles coarse crumbs, then adding just enough cold water to bring it together into a cohesive dough. This pastry will line pie plates, wrap around meat fillings, and form the basis for countless comfort foods. You observe the seasonal rhythms that define maritime cooking. In summer, you watch families preserving blueberries, apples, and other local fruits. The preservation methods vary. Some fruits are dried, others are made into jams and jellies. Still others are stored in root cellars or preserved in alcohol. These preserved fruits will become crucial ingredients in winter baking, adding sweetness and flavor to otherwise plain dishes. The influence of different cultural groups becomes apparent as you move through maritime communities. You visit Acadian kitchens where French techniques blend with local ingredients, creating dishes that are distinctly different from their Quebec counterparts. Scottish immigrants bring their own traditions, including techniques for making oat cakes and shortbread that adapt beautifully to local conditions. German settlers contribute their knowledge of preserved meats and hearty breads. You find yourself in a Lunenburg kitchen in the 1850s, watching a German-Canadian baker named Greta create what will become a regional specialty. She's making a pastry that combines German techniques with locally available ingredients, a sweet dough filled with apples and spices, formed into individual portions that can be eaten by hand. The pastry is richer than typical German versions because local dairy products are abundant, and she's adapted the spicing to local tastes and available ingredients. These individual pastries represent a common theme in Canadian comfort food development: the adaptation of old world techniques to new world ingredients and lifestyles. The pastries need to be portable for people working in fishing boats or lumber camps, substantial enough to provide lasting energy, and made from ingredients that are reliably available in maritime communities. Moving into the 20th century, you witness the development of distinctly Canadian approaches to comfort baking. You visit a small bakery in Charlottetown in 1925, where the baker is creating what he calls poor man's cake, a rich, dense cake made without eggs or butter, using ingredients that are affordable and available even during difficult times. The cake relies on creative substitutions: mayonnaise for eggs and butter, strong coffee for enhanced flavor, spices to mask any off notes from the unconventional ingredients. This type of creative substitution becomes a hallmark of Canadian comfort cooking, the ability to create satisfying, delicious food from whatever ingredients are available. You observe bakers using mashed potatoes to create moist cakes, incorporating vegetables into desserts not for health reasons, but because they improve texture and extend expensive ingredients, and developing techniques for making rich-tasting foods from simple, affordable components. You need to understand how these various comfort food traditions began converging and influencing each other. By the 1960s, you observe Canadian cooks becoming more mobile, traveling more frequently between provinces, and sharing recipes across regional boundaries. A family moving from Quebec to British Columbia brings their poutine knowledge while simultaneously learning about West Coast salmon preparation and berry picking traditions. This cultural exchange accelerates in the 1970s and 80s, and you witness the emergence of what becomes recognized as Canadian cuisine, not just individual regional dishes, but a broader understanding of Canadian food identity. Poutine begins appearing on menus outside Quebec, but adapted to local tastes and ingredient availability. Butter tarts become available in bakeries across the country, but with regional variations that reflect local preferences and ingredients. You observe the role of Canadian food media in this process. Food writers begin documenting and celebrating regional specialties, helping to spread awareness of dishes like poutine and butter tarts beyond their regions of origin. Cookbooks collect and preserve family recipes, standardizing measurements and techniques while maintaining the essential character of traditional dishes. The 1980s bring chain restaurants and food franchising to Canada, and you watch as this affects comfort food traditions. Some chains attempt to commercialize poutine, creating standardized versions that can be replicated anywhere but often lack the character of regional originals. Others focus on butter tarts, creating commercial versions that prioritize shelf life and shipping capability over the fresh-baked quality that defines the best examples. But you also observe resistance to this commercialization. Small-town diners and family bakeries continue making poutine with fresh local cheese curds and hand-cut fries. Independent bakers maintain butter tart traditions that prioritize quality over convenience. food enthusiasts begin seeking out authentic versions of these dishes, driving to small Quebec towns for real poutine or searching out bakeries that still make butter tarts from scratch. By the 1990s, you witness a renaissance of interest in authentic Canadian comfort foods. Food television begins featuring Canadian dishes, food festivals celebrate regional specialties, and a new generation of Canadian cooks begins exploring their culinary heritage with pride rather than embarrassment. Poutine moves from truck stops to upscale restaurants, where chefs experiment with premium ingredients, artisanal cheese curds, house-made gravies, hand-cut fries from specific potato varieties. This upscale treatment of humble foods represents a broader trend in Canadian cuisine, the recognition that comfort foods deserve the same attention to quality and technique as more formal dishes. You observe chefs taking butter tarts seriously, experimenting with different pastry techniques, sourcing better ingredients, and treating these traditional desserts as worthy of fine dining presentation. You need to understand the modern challenges facing these traditional foods. Climate change affects the dairy farms that produce cheese curds, changing weather patterns influence potato growing, and urbanization reduces the number of small bakeries and diners that traditionally served as keepers of food traditions. You observe food enthusiasts working to preserve traditional techniques, documenting family recipes, and teaching younger generations the skills needed to maintain food traditions. The globalization of food culture presents both opportunities and threats. You watch as Canadian comfort foods gain international recognition. Poutine appears on menus in New York and London. Butter tarts are featured in international food magazines. But this global exposure sometimes leads to versions that prioritize novelty over authenticity, creating confusion about what these dishes actually are and why they matter to Canadian culture. You find yourself in contemporary Canada, watching a new generation of food entrepreneurs working to preserve and evolve these comfort food traditions. Some focus on perfecting traditional versions, finding the best cheese curds, perfecting gravy recipes, maintaining the techniques that create the best butter tarts. Others experiment with creative variations while respecting the essential character of the original dishes. The conversation around these foods has become more sophisticated. You observe food writers discussing the cultural significance of poutine, the regional variations in butter tart preparation, the role of comfort foods in defining Canadian identity. These discussions recognize that food is about more than just taste. It's about memory, community, cultural continuity, and the stories we tell about ourselves. You witness the ongoing debates that surround these foods. Poutine purists argue about the proper type of cheese curds, the ideal gravy consistency, the correct frying technique for potatoes. Butter tart enthusiasts continue the raisin debate with undiminished passion, while also arguing about pastry thickness, filling consistency, and baking temperature. These debates aren't just about food, they're about authenticity, tradition, and the right to define what makes something genuinely Canadian. As you reach the present moment, you understand that these comfort foods represent something deeper than simple recipes. They embody the Canadian experience of making do with available ingredients, of adapting old world techniques to new world conditions, of finding richness and satisfaction in simple, honest food. Poutine represents Quebec's contribution to Canadian cuisine, but also the broader Canadian ability to create something uniquely satisfying from humble ingredients. Butter tarts embody the pioneer spirit of making something special from pantry staples, while also representing the ongoing negotiation between tradition and innovation that characterizes Canadian culture. These foods continue evolving, but they maintain their essential character, the combination of comfort, tradition, and unpretentious satisfaction that makes them distinctly Canadian. Whether you prefer your butter tarts with raisins or without, whether you insist on squeaky cheese curds in your poutine or accept reasonable substitutions, these foods represent a shared Canadian experience of finding joy in simple pleasures, of creating community around shared meals, and of maintaining connections to the past while adapting to present realities. The stories of these dishes are still being written. Each time someone makes poutine with fresh cheese curds, each time a baker pulls butter tarts from the oven, each time families gather around comfort foods that connect them to previous generations, these traditions continue. They adapt to new ingredients, new techniques, new cultural influences, but they maintain the essential qualities that made them beloved in the first place. Their ability to provide comfort, satisfaction, and a taste of home.
yang